Squad. The game where you die to a pixel and it's everyone's fault but your own, has over the past couple of weeks been testing out its Infantry Overhaul, and people were saying that if you play this, then going back to the original Squad is a lot harder. And I do agree to an extent, because there is so much that they're doing in these playtests that I really love, but it's good to see them acknowledge they strayed away from their roots, that being Project Reality, and that they were tempted to make the game similar to other shooters on the market. And it's also good to see developers use the public playtest feature to get feedback and fine-tune future updates. But moving on, let's take a quick look at Project Reality for a moment. I'm gonna draw some comparisons between the games, and I know people get very tribal about which one is better, and that's not my intention. I like both games and I play both games. But to keep things simple, I'd say a big difference between the two is accessibility. While they're both tactical shooters, one of them is a lot more difficult to get into in my opinion, and I say this because I got my casual friends that I persuaded to play both games, and they all said they liked Squad better because the game mechanics were easier to get into. One thing they said was that they didn't like how weapon sway was portrayed in Project Reality, and that the Squad system currently is better. Another thing about accessibility is the healing system. Anyone can revive anyone, and you can manage without a medic in Squad, but in Project Reality, straying too far away from the medic or lone wolfing is a pretty big detriment. However, anyone can pick up the medic class if they are downed. But another thing is that if there's a tank or a heli bullying you in Project Reality, you have to spawn, find an ammo crate, and then switch to HAT or AA. You can only get these specialized roles at a specific place that is put down. You can't just swap to it in Squad, where my friends also said is much easier to swap to these roles because you just click it in the menu screen and then you spawn in and you get the job done. And you also don't lose access to the role if you die, which to some people is a good thing because it insensitizes you. That's a big word for me to say, I apologize. It gives you the impression that you should stick close by a medic and not lone wolf, because if you lose the AA role, then I mean you're kind of screwed unless someone built an emplacement or someone in another squad or even your own air support is doing a good job. But for those that have played both games, we can agree that Project Reality is more punishing in certain mechanics. Not saying that's a bad thing or anything, but I bring this up because by implementing this Infantry Overhaul, I do believe a lot more of the casualer players might be put off by this. I know one of my mates who's a casual gamer, but he likes to play Squad more than my other ones, and he says the changes just aren't up his alley, and Squad is doing this to enhance teamwork and prolong firefights. To some of you, this is a major win or a major loss, and I want to talk about it specifically, what they're changing, and how me personally are actually really enjoying these changes and think that it's gonna really make Squad much better in the future. But now that we've gotten the comparison out of the way, what are the steps that OWI are taking to bring this game a little more closer to Project Reality in terms of infantry combat? And the first is Suppression. While there is already a light one in the game, it wasn't as inhibiting as the one in the playtest, because from my testing, I was trying to lob rockets at an enemy vehicle and they kept slinging rounds in our general direction, and paired with the more lethargic movement and animation, it was near impossible to steady and even line up a returning shot. Some people might not like this change, but it definitely does achieve the goal of slowing down the gameplay. Another good thing about the Suppression is using the heavy machine gun role. If you don't take one of these in your squad, it's a pretty big tactical mistake, because Suppression effects scale based on how big the caliber is, and it applies a flinch and stability penalty to the enemy. This is why coordinating with your squad to get a heavy machine gun player to a nice location is a good tactic, because it can aid a squad's push towards an objective or stop an enemy's advance in its tracks. And we did try to utilize this tactic in the playtest, which, funny thing is, because all the servers are mostly in America and Europe, I play with a lot of different people other than Aussies, which I usually do in squad. And from what I've found, honestly, is that the French and the Germans, I've never seen one sort of like muck around. They're also serious. It's like it isn't a game to them. It's like a role play kind of thing. I'm joking. Obviously not all of them are like that, but in the playtest, all of like the Europeans were taking it super seriously, and then the Americans were just discussing about giving like crack to the crackheads and have them just fucking build roads or some shit. But I'm sorry, that was one of the funniest fucking conversations I encountered in squad. But staying on topic, building fortifications can reduce the effects of suppression, but after experiencing the new suppression in game, it was glaringly different to what's currently in squad, and I personally prefer it. Now, the next big difference is the gun handling. I honestly thought in the base game there was a fair amount of sway already, even after draining all my stamina, but with the overhaul, they've taken some inspiration, or a fair amount of inspiration, from Project Reality by having the two dots at the bottom of the screen that determines how accurate you are. Most of the guns now have a lot of sway, especially the ones with scopes, and they say they're going to greatly adjust the differences between the guns, and what I imagine is your 5.56 and 5.45 weapons will be much easier to lay down constant fire when scoped compared to your much larger G3, which fires 7.62. Now, when you factor in that sight movements and getting suppressed can make you much more inaccurate, I found through testing this slows down the gameplay, because you gotta ask yourself in the moment, will I be able to get a shot off by the time it takes for me to steady up, or do I gamble and risk missing? Another interesting thing about the gun handling is trying to be effective at close quarters, especially with the scopes, and I found it much harder, and I was way more effective in close quarter combat without the scope and mowing people down in full auto. However, when it comes to combat, a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to me, and I usually find myself playing with the lat roll, especially the ones with the RPG frag rounds with the scope. It's totally not because I can't actually shoot people and that I literally need a rocket propelled explosive to deal with the enemy. It's totally not because of that. But one point of criticism that I've seen people bring up, and I'd like the Americans or anyone with combat experience to help me out with this, is firing in ADS or even from the hip with a machine gun. Would you be this inaccurate? I'm asking because a lot of people are saying the implementation into squad's infantry combat overhaul is unrealistic, and from my testing in the game, using it with a bipod, firing full auto with a scope can make you jump around a lot, and even firing it in ADS without the bipod can also throw you around so much to the point where it'll be very hard going one-on-one, which is why I'd recommend switching to your secondary. But I just want to know if this is actually a realistic representation of using a gun that would fire 5.56 or 7.62 in full auto with a machine gun. I will say though that I absolutely love the new animations. It feels more human and realistic, like you're swaying around, and apparently they got inspiration from body camera footage, and I feel bad for that one employee at OWI who had to go through all that body camera footage. But one criticism I see people bring up about the weapon sway changes is that it punishes people who are good at the game, and it makes it easier for worse players. And that's a pretty interesting argument, because I personally suck at combat in this game, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I'm a team player. I communicate, I follow orders. If no one wants to do the logi runs, I'll put my hand up and fucking do it. I don't care, someone has to do it, we'll lose otherwise if we don't. And yes, these combat changes do make it easier for me personally to be more competent in combat, because in the playtest, I found I was dying much less, and it made the game, dare I say, more enjoyable for a shitter like me. I personally prefer it, especially the weapon sway changes, because it just made it so much easier for me to return fire, because chances are that the person shooting at me is swaying around like a motherfucker and they couldn't even hit me in the first place. But I know that a lot of people don't like these changes, and I want to hear what you think about them, if you've tried them or based on what you're seeing in the gameplay. But the next major change to the gameplay is the movement speed. One glaring thing I noticed when going back to normal squad was just how maneuverable you are. Imagine trying to do an agility course with and without a backpack that weighs 10 kilos. In the overhaul, you felt a lot more wobbly. Jumping over things too takes much longer, and you die fairly easily if you fall from a high area now, such as a window, which I think is a absolutely welcome change. And I say this specifically because there have been times where some guy would camp inside a building and just jump out the window like Spider-Man when people start converging in on him and throwing nades up there. I imagine in real life, if you fell from this height in the gameplay, you'd probably break something, and I can't imagine you'd be very effective as you're screaming out in pain, so you're basically as good as dead. The devs did admit to speeding up the movement ages ago to get the player into combat faster, and this was most likely because a lot of people will say this game is a running simulator. Believe me, all of my friends told me the same thing, and that's also what I personally thought when I got most of the large-scale tactical shooters that we know and love, and I hated it until I got into the rhythm on how to approach certain scenarios and change my mindset. But the devs have also said through testing, by slowing down the movement, it encourages people to stick closer together as a squad. And that's an interesting point, because I did experience this in testing, but I also experienced this in the base game. If people are going to stick close and follow orders, they'll do it because they want to. If the random blueberry wants to go off and be Chris Kyle, they'll do that regardless of how the movement system is. Oh, actually, they'll probably just complain more if the infantry combat overhaul goes through. But I will agree that by slowing down the movement, it does give squad leaders a little more time to plan and coordinate. Even though I absolutely hate playing as SL and squad, I panic way too easily and I get stressed if I'm not like on the microphone every 5 seconds relaying information. But that's just me. I don't like to play SL unless it's like hell let loose, which is a little bit more tamer in my opinion. But all of these changes in the combat overhaul are things that I personally am looking forward to being implemented. Some people are not happy with these changes for reasons such as it won't encourage communication, which is a large reason why this overhaul is happening. Also, that by changing the movement, you make the game more clunky and tedious. But I don't think these changes are incompetent and swaying away from what squad is, but rather going back to its roots. Unlike other developers who have no experience in the game that they've acquired and are changing the game mechanics to be worse off. So it's good to see that the devs are going back to what they originally wanted squad to be. You gotta ask yourself, on one hand, the devs are making what they want, but it could also drive away some people by making it less accessible to more casual players, but that could be exactly what you want, and personally I'm on board with it. Anyways, I want you to like this video and click the video that is on screen because I know you'll enjoy it.